Hello, Illinois Council for Exceptional Children attendees to our very first virtual conference. Today, I am super excited to bring in a guest that I think that we all need right now. It is such an appropriate time to be talking about what this man has to offer. His name is Dr. Matthew Dewar. How are we doing?
Awesome. How are you, Michael?
I'm just fantastic. Thank you. I'm just a pleasure to have you here right now. Um, he has a load of credentials, and I'm going to save us some time, and you can check that out right at the end. There'll be a nice link. He has written Education and Well-Being and Ontological Inquiry, mostly an academic text for graduate and doctoral students, and yet he has a new book that is going to be coming out, and it's the Mindful Breathing Workbook for Teens. And it should be available on any platform that you use to go and purchase materials. So this will be coming out this summer. Dr. Dewar, let's get into it. You and I have had the chance to connect a few times, and I'm just completely blown away on just your professional and your personal outlook on life. And you have so much to offer the people here at ICEC. So let's kind of get this kicked off here. Can you talk about your personal and your professional journey when you started in this profession, and why are you so passionate about well-being?
Great question, and I'll try not to get lost in the weeds, and I'll try to keep it short and sweet. But just starting with the personal aspect of the journey, by the time I was 5, my house was visited by death, divorce, and addiction. I remember a handful of years ago when I first looked at the ACE inventory, Adverse Childhood Experiences. I looked at it and I realized I was scored like a 6 or a 7 on it. And so my childhood was interesting. It was there was a lot of emotional dysregulation in my environment, and it was kind of bizarre. I grew up in Lake Forest, which is an affluent community on the North Shore. And so there was this real bizarre dichotomy between what I was experiencing at home and what was outwardly projected in the community. And I could talk about that tension and that dynamic for a long time, but we'll just leave it at that in and of itself was just really an interesting experience. I really struggled in school. I didn't care about school. In fact, I had to repeat 2 different grades in the course by the time I finished high school. I'd repeated a year of high school, and I repeated, I think it was first grade, because I was unruly. I didn't pay attention. I tried to run away from school multiple times. I threw a football through a window on a dare, through a classroom window at lunch. In high school, I bought a couple hundred crickets, and I let them loose in the school.
Wow.
All over, and I got caught. My friend ratted me out. So I was, if teachers think about that kid, right? That kid that they have in their class who just grinds on them, is just always looking to stir things up and entertain people. That was me. I was that guy. And long story short, I went to Catholic school from kindergarten through my sophomore year of high school. And after my sophomore year of high school, I transferred to a private school, actually Lake Forest Academy. And it was, the only reason I got in was because I was good at sports, basketball in particular. So they kind of let me in to play basketball. And I had to repeat my sophomore year when I got there. And it was at Lake Forest Academy where, for the first time in my life, I was exposed to educators who were just truly understood what learning is about, and that it's about human development. It's about a person and their particular life journey, and not just delivering academic content. And I'll never forget getting called into the dean's office for the first time at Lake Forest Academy. And I was so familiar with this particular kind of moment. all throughout my schooling. I was sent to the principal's office and the vice principal's office, and they just kept handing me off because everyone was just sick of dealing with me. And so I get to the academy. I'm told to go to the dean. And I remember walking into his office and just pausing because of his demeanor. He was just relaxed, sitting back in his chair. There was nothing emotionally pressing about his disposition. So I walked in. He said, "Hey, have a seat on my couch." And I sat down. And he just sat there quietly, and he just kind of looked at me. I looked at him. He didn't say anything. There's just this moment of pause. And then he said, "Matt, I want you to help me to understand why you are the way you are." Now, I had no idea what to say, right? No one had ever opened up a space. No one had ever given me the opportunity to articulate why I was the person that I was, why I did the things that I did. Instead, they were just denouncing what I was doing and punishing me and labeling me. But no one ever said, "Here's a space. Reveal to me, talk to me about your internal process. Why do you feel it is necessary to do these types of things and to be this kind of person?" And I just remember saying to him, I don't know. And he said, "That's okay. You don't have to, but I want you to think about it and we're going to talk again." And I was like, okay. And I just remember walking out. Then, before I walked out, he said, I want you to know that I think you're a lot more intelligent than you give yourself credit for. And if you spend as much time trying to develop yourself as you do trying to make other people laugh, I really think, your life could take off in a positive trajectory. And here it is 20 some years later, and that conversation still resides in the red hot center of my mind like it happened yesterday. And so this is the type of moment where for me, it was life-changing. And it's also the type of moment where, as an educator, when I find that I move into a space where I'm about to start labeling and judging and wanting to punish a kid for their behavior, I can stop and pause and recalibrate and remind myself of my own journey, where I came from, and then have that cognitive reframing of the situation that can allow me to address the person behind the behavior and their life process, their life journey, and not just denouncing or trying to correct what is most immediately happening. And there's been a number of instances where in my teaching career, and again, if this 45 minutes was just about me telling stories, I could tell these, but it's not. But where I had a student who was very disruptive. I mean, he was the version of me as a high schooler, and I had him as a freshman. And so I tried all these different creative ways to collaborate with him and get him on my side and win him over. And he just throughout the course of the year became more rude. He became, where I finally lost it was he started becoming really antagonistic with his peers in the class and picking on kids who were quiet. To me, that was a very alarming behavior. And so this one day he said something to another classmate, and I kicked him out. I kicked him out of the class. I told him to go into the hall, which I have probably done 2 or 3 times in my entire career, 18 years. And I followed him out, and I was about to just let loose on him. I had had enough. And this poor kid he was picking on is like just so innocent and so helpless. And he's just dialing into this kid. So I'm about to just unleash rage, and some better part of my nature showed up, and all of a sudden I found coming out of my own mouth, "Help me understand why you are the way you are." Literally came out of my mouth, but I was about to say. And he looked at me, and I said, "I don't want you coming back in class, and I don't want you to come back to class until you write a letter to me explaining why you are the way you are." And he said, this is effing bullshit. Sorry. And all this stuff. And I said, that's fine. That's fine. It is, whatever. But you're still going to do it. And so the very next day he came in and he handed me a letter, and he had a grin on his face, and he walked out, and I read it, and it was all about what was going on at home. And there was a whole story, right? As there always is.
Yeah.
And that was an absolute turning point. We followed up, we had a conversation, and when he was leaving his senior year, it was the last day of school for seniors. It was 7th period. We have 8 periods in our day, and I was free, and it was right before my 8th period senior class. And he popped in, and he's like, hey, what's up? I just wanted to say goodbye and all this stuff. And we had talked kind of back and forth a little bit his sophomore, junior, and senior year. And he said, do you remember I wrote you that letter my freshman year? And I said, I absolutely do. It's in my desk in the office. And he said, yeah, that was huge. And I can't thank you enough for that.
Wow.
Right. And so I'm rambling here, and I am getting lost in the weeds. Like I said, I wouldn't, but it just shows that if we can access people's stories, if we can remember that everyone's on their own journey, just as we're on our own journey. And when we open a space where we can be invited or invite ourselves into someone's journey, it can have a profound effect on how they understand who they are, how students understand who they are, what they think is possible for them, for their life, etc. So that's kind of the personal the personal journey. I could go on more, but then the professional aspect was about 10 years ago now, 9 years ago. I walked into a 3rd period class with freshmen who had just received word that their friend had committed suicide. And this was a really horrible situation where the student was at school before school started. And then when the bell rang for 1st period, he handed his belongings to his best friend and said, hey, I want you to have it. It was like his wallet. And his friend's like trying to get to class and is like, why is he handing me this stuff? And then the student walked out the front doors of the school, across the front lawn, and put himself down on the train tracks. And we had just received an email as a faculty, but we were told that the students didn't yet know. What I didn't know is that his core hub of friends were all in my class, 3rd period. So I walk into this room having just read the email, not anticipating that my students would know. I walk in, it's emotional triage. Kids are, just obliterated with grief. And, to this day, I get teary just thinking about that class period and what we shared together as a class. And that was actually the second of 3 situations that were all very similar that happened within the course of about 3 months. 2 months, 3 months, where we had 3 students all within a mile of train track, male students, a freshman, a sophomore, and a senior, take their lives. And so at that point, because I had struggled with stress and anxiety as a teen and young adult, and because of that struggle, I ended up going to the other side of the world. I dropped out of college without telling my parents. I went and I lived in a Buddhist monastery to learn how to meditate, to calm myself down. I thought, this is where I need to go, somewhere beautiful, somewhere serene. And I dropped out of school. I get on a plane. I go to the other side of the world. I didn't tell my parents I was dropping out. And the first thing I wrote in my journal was I traveled 7,000 miles and my mind did not move. And it was one of the biggest revelations of my life, where I realized that you can go to the other side of the world, but wherever you go, there you are. And whatever your internal environment is, you bring it with you. And so as I say to my students, the world is a big place, but it's not big enough to escape yourself. And so sometimes it takes a failed outward journey to begin the inward journey. And when I came back, I was there for 4.5 months. I came back And that's really when I started digging deep into the research, into different practices related to well-being, so on and so forth. And so as I started my teaching career, I was just a regular classroom teacher. But when we had these suicides, it was a tipping point for our school and our community to start thinking more deliberately about emotional intelligence, emotional well-being, and resources we need to start providing to that end. And so that's really where professionally I was able to channel my personal interest into my professional life. And it soon became a position as well-being coordinator. Now I'm the social emotional learning instructional coach, and writing books, and able to share this work with school districts all over the country, which has been a really powerful and meaningful experience.
Dr. Dewar, that's quite the touching story, and that's how we can kind of see as people, we're kind of results of our experiences, our ACE scores, and how important it is to really identify those and to know it, because as you said, you don't have to go all the way across the world to really find meaning. I mean, you almost found it in the office, when you were getting reprimanded when you were a kid. You found it was that close to you. So I really appreciate you sharing that, and I think it's so insightful to know that no matter wherever we escape to, we might not always find those answers, but those answers are maybe found by knowing that it is not there, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And sometimes I really do believe I never would have had the realization that I had I not gone to the other side of the world. I needed for that journey to fail, to take it to the farthest extreme. Just me personally, I'm not saying everyone needs to do this, but where I was in the state I was in, I needed to do that to confront the truth that what I was looking for, I always had. I mean, it's the Wizard of Oz story. you get to Oz and you realize it's just a guy behind a curtain playing with some dials, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just so.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you again for sharing that. It just again seems like you are a really good foundation for those students over at your high school right now as being the well-being coordinator. I love that position. I think that's great because we really do need to allocate that, that position to really focus on helping our social emotional and addressing our ACE scores. So we talked about your personal and your professional life and how it has really impacted you to be the man that you are today. Let's talk about a new project you are working on right now. What is this?
Just this summer, I'll have a book coming out called the Mindful Breathing Workbook for Teens. And the goal of the book, well, really the history of the book is it's the history of the last 5 years of integrating mindfulness into a school district and realizing how impactful awareness of breath can be for developing self-awareness and self-management skills. And so when I start every class with a mindful breathing exercise where I help students build the skill of recognizing their internal state through their breathing. So take 1 minute and we go through a series of posture checks, go through a series of basic benchmarks of breathing. Is my breathing light? Is it slow? Is it deep? Or is it fast, shallow? Light, slow, and deep, fast, shallow, and which one? Light, slow, or in heavy, sorry. And so they go through and they monitor kind of on a continuum, like where's my state at in this moment and how is that reflected in my breathing? And once they recognize where their state is at via their breathing, then you can use the breath as a tool to shift your state back into that middle space that we want. And we'll talk about this more in a minute, but the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system is like a teeter-totter with the sympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for alertness, and the parasympathetic, which is responsible for calm. And what we want, what we're instinctively, innately driven to try to attain is a balanced teeter-totter, so to speak, where we have alertness with calm. And when we start shifting either way, it's reflected in our breathing. And when we can realize that, then we can manipulate our breathing to come back into that middle space. And the thing that's so wonderful about breathing, I mean, there are many ways to do this. Breathing's not the only technique, but breathing is universally accessible. You're always breathing. You're never
thinking about breathing.
You're never at a distance. And human beings are unique because we're the only breathing beings that can consciously manipulate and alter breathing to manipulate and alter our internal state. That the relationship between emotion and respiration is bidirectional. That our emotions manifest in our breathing, and then our breathing can change our emotions. And leveraging that power is a wonderful foundational emotional intelligence skill that we can leverage it at any point. And so that's ultimately what the book is about, is helping teens leverage their breathing for greater emotional intelligence and well-being.
Yeah, and Dr. Dewar, I'm going to kind of connect this to the Navy SEALs, right? Like we can go from the Navy SEALs all the way to our students in the educational setting. The Navy SEALs have to understand breathing because once they're breathing, their heart rate is dysregulated. There we see responses to certain situations, not the way that they should be responding, right? Because they're thinking about their breathing and they're keeping their heart rate down. Therefore, they're able to manage what is the output. So I think that's awesome. I really love that. And I think, is this going to touch on some of your core principles about stress and stress management? Like your overarching framework for thinking about stress?
Yeah. Just quickly to go back to the breathing and what you were just saying, the breath, respiration is your body's first line of defense against stress. So the first thing to become dysregulated under stress or distress is your breath. And I know from personal experience and practice that the more you develop self-awareness through breath awareness or emotional awareness through breath awareness, the more quickly you'll start to identify dysregulations in your breathing before you realize dysregulations in your internal state. And that's what's so powerful is that emotions are often a late responder to the scene of stress. The breath is the first responder. I use this analogy with students all the time, that breathing is like the tachometer on your dashboard in your car. So it shows the RPMs. Where are my emotional RPMs at? And the breath is also the gear shifter. So if you realize that you're in neutral, so to speak, but your RPMs are running really high and redlining, it's like we've got a problem here. And so then we can then manipulate the breathing like a gear shifter to bring those RPMs back down. Going on to your next question, one of the first things I always say to colleagues and students is that we all want to be happy. There's kind of two universal human truths. We all want to be happy, and we're really bad at being happy. So it's like, where do we go astray? Like I always say to students, raise your hand if you want to be miserable, right? And of course, no one raises their hand. And yet too many people, young adults and adults, find themselves living lives that they find very oppressive and intolerable. The CDC a few years ago developed a category of disease called diseases of despair, which is death by alcohol, death by substances, drugs, 2/3 of which are opioid related, and death by suicide. From 1999 to 2016, the suicide rate in the US went up, I think it was 34%. And I think in 10 states, it was up over 50%.
Wow.
And an economist at Dartmouth found that the peak age for unhappiness in the United States is between 47.2 years old and 48.2. So if you're before that age, sorry, you're still bottoming out. If you're past it, everything's good. But what it's showing is that, again, we all want to be happy. We really do. We just don't attain it very often. And we don't attain it because we don't understand that the brain is designed to survive. It's not designed to optimize. Let me say that again. Your brain is designed to survive and not optimize. And this explains why it's so easy to get into bad habits. And it's because your brain is wired to survive, which means your brain privileges immediate rewards. Even if the immediate rewards, when the cost, right, of a given behavior is offset, it's on the back end. If you think about this, that's what a bad behavior is. Let's take the diseases of despair. People are dysregulated. A real easy way to try to take the edge off of stress and anxiety is to drink some alcohol. Right. You don't need a PhD to have alcohol work in your chemistry, right? You just very passively drink it and it does the work for you. So in the moment, does it work? Of course it works. That's why so many people drink to manage their internal state, right? To varying degrees. I'm not saying everyone's got a drinking problem, but people use alcohol to modulate their internal state, to relax. The problem is that habit, the cost is later on and it's compounded. And when we look at good habits of optimizing, it is an immediate sacrifice for the reward that comes later. So it's the reverse paradigm, and it's very hard for our brains to buy into that. Right? Because they're designed to your brain wants to automate homeostasis right now. And if it's a chocolate cake, if it's binging Netflix, if it's drinking alcohol, if it's doing drugs, if it's doing one of the many bad habits that are out there, we will be more inclined and more attracted to doing that, even if we have to pay the price later. And I always say that often our worst habits are misguided and unskillful attempts to manage stress. Let me say that again. Our worst habits are misguided and unskillful attempts to manage stress. And it's because we don't understand that the brain has this bias that we have to take into consideration when thinking about our happiness and stress. So that aside, when we look at stress in and of itself, there's really two kinds of stress. Stress that is disabling and stress that empowers. And the difference between the two is skill. Are you utilizing skill when confronting stress? And if you're not, then it goes stress, unskillful response, like the many I just mentioned, let's just say alcohol or drugs to modulate your state. So you have stress, unskillful response, that creates distress. And what's distress versus stress? Distress is stress that you think is unmanageable, right? When you start thinking that the stress you're confronting is outside of your control and you can't manage it, that's when stress becomes distress. And the thing about using strategies like alcohol is that they're outside-in strategies rather than inside-out strategies. So there's no skill development. So when you manage the state or you calm yourself down, you're no more equipped to deal with that state in the future, which means you're taking agency away from yourself, which makes you more prone to feeling distressed later. So it goes stress, unskillful response, distress, dysfunction, disease, disability, and then ultimately, if taken to the furthest extreme, death. And that's what I call the maladaptive stress cycle. And that's juxtaposed with or contrasted with the adaptive stress cycle, the skill-based stress response, where you have stress, skillful response, positive adaptation, and growth. And that's really what we're looking for, is to develop those skillful responses so that we can make stress a catalyst for emotional intelligence and well-being.
I really love your comparison to the car. In driving stick shift, perhaps, I know that we can see in an automatic car, we can kind of see our speedometer or whatever. I'm not a car guy. It's going into the gear ramp, and you're kind of knowing where we need to go ahead and shift. But also we have to be mindful that when we're shifting, we got to keep our foot on the gas and release the clutch, right? So then they're kind of going like this. So learning stick shift in a nutshell is very hard to do.
Yeah.
And, from your examples there of kind of showing is that the way that we react to stress, whether it's that immediate relief of going to the alcohol, or are we going to use some strategies that we have we practiced our stick shift in order to get it past that gear so we're not stalling out and damaging our car. We're going to need a whole new transmission. I absolutely love that. Now, how do you get all of your students to buy into this? And let me tie in the not wonderful, COVID-19. You present this framework that, in theory, when you're able to practice it effectively, you can really manage your life and have better outcomes. So how are you getting your students to buy into this, especially with the unique challenges that COVID-19 brings to stress and stress management?
Before I get to those questions, I just want to say something real quick. If you don't know whether your responses to stress are skillful or not, ask yourself this question. Does my go-to response or responses to, or reactions to stress increase, decrease, or keep stable my baseline well-being now and over time? Let me say that again. So let's use the example of drinking alcohol, because it's so easy, and
Right.
So many people do it in this culture. Does this habit increase, keep stable or constant, or decrease my well-being now and over time and through time, right? And so when you look at it through that lens, you see that it doesn't help your it might, you could argue at some level that it does help your well-being in that instead of being at a 10 out of 10 in terms of stress, you're now at a 5 out of 10, a 6 out of 10, or whatever, right? So in the moment, maybe that's a better place to be than 10 out of 10. So in that sense, it's an increase immediately in your well-being, but there's a significant cost incurred to your well-being, which we could go through a whole litany of things that end up as a result of leaning on drinking as a self-management tool over time. And so that question is really important because it helps us hone in on what are the things that allow us to create that positive trajectory now as well as over time, that allows us to continue to build our well-being over time. So that's one. And two, when we think about stress, like what is stress? And I could give you a technical definition, but I want to give you an analogy. We all know what a metronome is, right? It ticks, and people used to use them, I believe, for instruments, pianos and stuff. Yeah. And so it's like tick, 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 and you can set it. Well, we all have an emotional metronome, and it's ticking. And our environment has a metronome as well, and it's ticking. And well-being, that teeter-totter, when it's a balance between alertness and calm, that's when our internal metronome is in sync with the environmental metronome, and everything's going in unison. And our emotions are transparent to the activity that we're engaged in. We're not even thinking about our internal state. We're just living life. That's where we love to be. Csikszentmihalyi, the psychologist, calls this flow experience, where we're just engaged in the moment, everything disappears. That's when our internal emotional metronome is synced with the metronome of the situation. Now, stress is when our metronome doesn't match the external metronome, either because it's too slow or it's too fast. So sometimes our internal metronome is just going tick, 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 and your environment's going tick, 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 tick. And then there's this dissonance, and that's stressful. And we need to find a way to bring the cadence, speed it up so it matches what's being asked of us. What do people typically do in our culture? They drink caffeine to do that. Right? You wake up in the morning and your internal metronome's like tick, tick. Yeah. And then you're about to get into a classroom with 25 kids and you're like, I better speed this thing up.
I better start ticking.
Right? So I'm drinking caffeine now. And then the problem is at night, now the environment is just tick, tick, and internally you're tick, 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 tick. So what do? That's stress. Then now you're leaning on depressants to bring you downers, to slow your internal metronome down. And so we're constantly, whether we're aware of it or not, we're constantly unconsciously motivated to find that synced cadence. And if we can make it a conscious process and realize when our internal rhythm is out of sync with the external rhythm, that's the self-awareness piece. And then when we recognize that, what are the behaviors, what are the corrective behaviors we engage in to modify, to adjust, to align with where we need to be. So that's a really key point. Now, in relation to COVID is amazing.
Yeah.
It's not amazing, but it's amazing from someone who's interested in stress and someone who researches stress. And it's amazing from that end because when we get stressed out, our margin for error in our self-care gets smaller. I sometimes compare it to, it's like the faster you go on a highway, the smaller the shoulders get and the smaller the lanes get and the more packed the lanes get. And so you're like white knuckle driving, right? There's no margin for error. And when you're relaxed, it's like suddenly the highway's open, there's expansive shoulders, your lane is huge, there's few cars there.
Yeah.
And what COVID has done is it's revealed the lapses and the weaknesses and the oversights in our self-care. That so many people are really not skilled at taking care of themselves. And COVID has really brought this to the forefront. It's made us realize where our architecture of mind, our inner emotional architecture is weak and breaks down. And so we have to examine this. And so if you were to create a situation that hit all the major kind of criteria for stress, imminent threat to your health and well-being, lack of control of what's going on, perception of things getting worse, an indeterminate time frame, right? They know is stress. If you know when it's going to end, it's significantly less stressful. They've done this with people going to dentist's office, getting the same procedure for the same amount of time. One group is told how long it will be, and the other group is not. And then they self-report how uncomfortable it was after. Guess which group is like, oh, that wasn't bad at all. And guess which group is like, that was horrible, right?
Scheduled group loved it.
Right. They didn't love it. They were just like, it wasn't, no one loves going to the dentist.
Yeah.
But it's the group that doesn't know, where there's this ambiguity about when will this end. That group truly suffers. So that's another criteria. And then the one thing we're kind of designed to do to self-regulate is socially connect. We're such a social species. And now, if we like, the worst thing we can do is socially connect in person. And so when you look at COVID, it's hitting all these major triggers of stress all at once. And on top of that, the brain loves to automate predictable behaviors. This is called serial processing. Your brain loves to, like brushing your teeth, tying your shoes. It loves to have you perform these tasks with very little what's called psychological vigilance, where you barely have to pay attention, because that's metabolically efficient. Your brain has to use less energy. What's stressful is being in an environment where you have to think about every little thing that you're doing. Do I wear a mask? How long do I wear the mask? Do I touch the mask? Oh, I touched the mask accidentally. Now do I take the mask off? That person's not wearing a mask. Do I go to the store? Do I pick it up? Do I wipe the food down? Do I leave it in the garage before I bring it in the house? Do I, right?
Yeah.
And so we have to think about all these things that we didn't have to think about before. And that's just burning through our internal resources, so that when real stressors come in, we're already depleted. We're already at a deficit because we're having to maintain this state of hypervigilance all the time. So that's a real issue. Two more things I think with COVID that are really significant is that people need to stop waiting for things to be normal again.
Right.
Too many people are living off their heels. They're in a holding pattern. And that makes you, research shows, that makes you more susceptible to stress. One thing we know is that we tend to deal with stress better with forward movement. So you might not be able to create goals 6 months out anymore or a year out. So then that doesn't mean just give up on goals and kind of live in a holding pattern. It means recalibrate your goals, move them closer, and identify on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, behaviors and things you can do to move towards those goals. And this gives you a sense of proactively acting on your environment. And this increases agency. And the more agency someone has, the more resilient they are in the face of stress. And the last message regarding COVID, and I shared this with students right away when it first started happening, is I said, be careful that you don't make temporary lifestyle adjustments into permanent lifestyle habits. Too many people during this time think, oh, well, this is just during COVID, so I'm just going to stay up later. I'm going to sleep later. I'm going to just, sit around more. And you start making these temporary tweaks to your lifestyle, but in a blink of an eye, you're a month into it, you're 6 months into it, and you're still doing these things. And now they're becoming permanent lifestyle habits. So be mindful of not turning temporary lifestyle adjustments into permanent lifestyle habits.
Absolutely. I mean, I think I'm just going to kind of wrap that. And, again, like we need to understand the tools in order to move us forward and be able to really address our metronome in a positive way, to where we don't have to slow it down with external substances, but where we can internally slow that down. Dr. Dewar, we got about a minute and a half here. So let's kind of just ground my man. This goes, it's a time capsule. I don't know what happens. It goes. So, let's just, for the last minute here, we've grounded this into education. Let's help out our students, teachers, and our administrators, because they don't know what's coming next either. Some specific techniques and strategies that we can employ. Now, we got about a minute, but...
Okay, I'm going to hurry up. And I'm just going to say, this is very relevant to education. In states of stress, our psychological immune system is weakened, and we become more vulnerable to being infected by other people's negativity and anxiety. And I see this in education, is that all of a sudden you get an avalanche of stress, negativity, and anxiety ripping through schools. And so if teachers don't self-regulate and they don't practice self-care, they're going to be infected with negativity, and that's going to transfer into their work and how they lead and regulate the students in their care. One of the things we know about emotional intelligence is the person of influence in any given situation, a parent, a coach, a teacher, a principal. The person of influence is who everyone else looks to self-regulate. That person of influence sets the emotional tone for everyone else. So you need to be conscious of that. And in terms of regulating our stress and just strategies, there are preventative strategies and there are stress interventions and stress preventions. And one of the best things we can do to prevent stress is harmonize our sleep-wake cycle. One of the things about stress is that we get what's called a late cortisol pulse, which means cortisol is our stress hormone, and it peaks in a healthy person in the morning, and then it dips in the evening, so we fall asleep. So we're active in the morning and energetic and alert, and then we're calm at night. And what we have in people who experience stress, depression, and anxiety is a reversal, where they have very low cortisol in the morning and very high cortisol at night. And the best way to correct this is to wake up in the morning around when the sun rises and get outside within 30 minutes of waking up and get natural sunlight on your eyes for 2 to 10 minutes. In the dead of winter, when it's totally overcast, it'll take about 10 minutes. What this does is it programs your circadian rhythm. And within 3 to 4 days, you can start seeing measurable effects. When you get that light on your eyes, it sets an internal biological clock where 16 hours later, you're going to get tired and want to sleep. So people who have a hard time falling asleep and calming down at night, the best thing you can do is set your circadian rhythm in the morning. When you wake up early, get outside. It has to be outside. Windows filter out photons. And you have these cells on your eyes called melanopsin ganglion cells. They're photoreceptors for light. If you get outside, you get that light, it syncs your rhythm. This is so important to your self-care because you can do all these other techniques, but if your basic biological rhythm is off, which for most people in the United States it is, your techniques and things you implement will only have a marginal impact. You really have to reset your system so that you're alert at the appropriate time and you're tired at the appropriate time. And I wish I could talk more about it, but we'll end there. Maybe I'll talk about it in my breakout session if people have questions.
Everybody hit up that breakout session. Dr. Dewar, I really appreciate you coming on here. Again, this is some information that we need because we need to protect ourselves by having that self-awareness, understanding self-care, and really knowing how our internal metronome is going. So, Dr. Dewar, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for being our keynote speaker here at ICEC.
Thank you for having me. And I'll talk more about the techniques since we didn't get to them in my breakout session.
Fantastic. All right.
Thank you.